Hello everyone, how's it going? It is Tyrnor as always, and now that the expansion is over, I suppose it's time for me to do one of these videos on Legion. Now Legion is in a bit of a funny spot for me, at least when compared with the other expansions. That's because, well, to put it simply, I don't think it's that great when it comes to its lore. It's not bad, definitely not as bad as Worlds of Draenor, but it's not great. It's decent, I suppose, perhaps good? I'm not entirely certain. And because of this, even though I think it's a better expansion when it comes to the lore than Warlords, I actually had a much tougher time finding things I really like about the lore of Legion, and most of those things are kind of generic and obvious. I think I can sum it up as Warlords had a bad general story and really good side stories and smaller details, while Legion had a decent general story with some really questionable stuff in it. Well, there's three major things I dislike with the general story of Legion, which I will detail in this video. But again, as a reminder, this video is basically a very opinionated look at 5 things I dislike about the lore of an expansion and 5 things I like about it, in addition to a small discussion on what I think of the overall direction of the story of said expansion. Those 5 things I like and the 5 I dislike are not the only things I like or dislike about the expansion, it's just sort of an artificial limitation making me narrow down my choices. Also, the things I will mention are not in any particular order, so it won't be leading up to the thing I dislike or like the most, for instance. And as always, this is just my opinion, you are free to disagree. I imagine with this video especially there will be disagreements, and I will again only address the in-game lore, not expanded universe works which took place in the timeline of this expansion. Now, starting off, the overall direction of the expansion story is in the title. The Legion and its invasion of Azeroth, and pretty much the entire focus of the expansion story is on this threat, which is perfectly understandable. You don't have the biggest invasion of the Burning Legion be just a minor thing or a side quest. In fact, I think it's the expansion that was the most focused on its threat of all the others, with perhaps Cataclysm coming into second place. And most of the elements of the story revolve around the invasion of the Burning Legion, even the Emerald Nightmare or the High Mountain conflict. So, what do I think of the overall story of Legion, of how it was handled? I think it was handled well enough, I suppose. It's not bad, and it definitely feels right, as in, yeah, the threat of the Legion is highly effective, unlike, for instance, the threat of Worlds of Draenor, and the actions of the quote-unquote good guys, our actions, also feel right, as in believable, and they feel like they're having some impact. But for the most part it feels rather predictable, arguably even a little cliché. It's an epic story filled with cool moments, but it's also pretty brainless at times. And like Warlords of Draenor, which one could argue was a show for the Warcraft movie, Legion does feel like a very fan-servicey expansion where a lot of stuff happened because it's popular or it's cool rather than because it would tell a good story. And actually those 3 major dislikes that I mentioned before and that I'm going to talk about all have to do with this. They're stuff I consider to be bad and poorly thought out fan service. Besides that, going into this expansion, and I think I speak for most people when I say this, I honestly did not expect them to put an end to the Burning Legion. And that's because the Burning Legion has been a threat, a present force pretty much since the inception of Warcraft, and it's something that's always been looming in the background. By no means am I saying that it's a bad thing that they've killed off the Legion and its leaders, well, they could come back, but rather that it was unexpected and that it happened very quickly, really. It feels weird to be part of a Warcraft universe where the Legion is not really a threat anymore, at least not an imminent one. Now, as to how they handled this story, how they ended it rather, I think they did a good enough job. I don't really have much to complain about there. I guess perhaps I would have liked to see Velen and Kil'jaeden interact a little more, and maybe they could have used Gul'dan a bit more, but no biggie. I'm satisfied with the ending of this expansion, which does help mitigate some of my dislikes, I guess you could say. Now on that topic, let's start with my first dislike. This is not one of the big 3 that I mentioned previously, and honestly, it's not that big of a dislike, it's just something that's kind of been simmering in the background whenever I think of the lore of Legion. And that is the fact that this invasion of the Burning Legion, touted by Blizzard to be the biggest invasion ever, surpassing even the War of the Ancients, does not really feel that big. It honestly feels more like there's a War of the Burning Legion and 90% of the action is happening on the Broken Isles. Now we do get some minor hints that stuff is happening in the rest of the world, and some of the class campaigns do deal with that, but with the exception of when you go to Argus and see all of the Legion ships closing in on Azeroth and you see Sargeras assaulting the planet, it really just feels like a very, very localized war. A big localized war, but still localized. And honestly, I don't know how exactly they could fix this, so it's part of the reason why it's not that big of a complaint. The only way I can really think of them fixing this is do another Cataclysm style rework of the entire world, but that's just impractical and not something you can realistically expect of them. Now, the first thing on my like list is the class campaigns and the stories of the artifact weapons. Now, they're not all perfect, and some are definitely better than others, but I don't think there's any that are just outright awful. It feels great to finally have some class identity in the game, and most of them were good stories in their own right. It was also great to finally have some of the missing weapons in the lore actually be revealed and be important, namely Philomelorn and to a lesser extent the Scythe of Elune, and others play important roles in the story. And I feel the send-off they got was really the only way they could get rid of them properly, though I do hope to at least see the sentient ones come back in the future, namely the Skull of the Monari, Xal'atath and Aluneth, since they are arguably characters of their own. And speaking of characters, this is one of my major dislikes with the expansion, namely Illidan, the way Illidan was portrayed. Now, I made a 27-minute video on it and why I have a problem with that, and I obviously can't reproduce every single thing I've said there, so I'm going to give a very short TLDR and invite you to watch my other video and see what I mean. So, the TLDR is: Illidan is a character who does not benefit from character development, instead his entire personality and even parts of his history get retconned. They've done it once with Burning Crusade, and they've done it again with Legion. One could even argue that they've done it one more time even during Legion. And the current incarnation of Illidan is really obnoxious. I've used this comparison before, but he honestly feels like he's always Julius Caesar preparing to cross the Rubicon, and he always acts like that even when there is no actual Rubicon to cross. TLDR over, let's move on to one of my likes. And one of my likes, and actually a pretty big one, is how they developed Velen's character in this expansion. Now, to use another example from literature, comic books. There was a writer whose name I can't remember off the top of my head who said something to the likes of, "The Marvel universe has characters while the DC universe has icons. And before Legion, Velen definitely fit into the category of icons. He was always the steadfast force for good and for the light. He was always calm and compassionate, and I'm not saying that was a bad thing. In fact, Velen, even before Legion, was one of my favorite characters in the lore. But I do really like what they did with the character in this expansion, since this is the moment where he cracks, where that public face he's been maintaining breaks. And to his credit as a character and a person, he continues to be resolute against the Legion. He does crack, you see him at his weakest point throughout the expansion, but he as a person does not break. In fact, he becomes all the more resolute and all the more stronger. And it was honestly awesome to see him, Velen, who was always the victim in the storyline, who always avoided conflicts and ran, to see him take an active role and go on the offensive. His moment with Talgath was especially cool, where he subverts the trope of the mustache-twirling villain getting away. Now on that note, my next dislike, and this is again one of the big three, is Xe'ra. Now your first thought is going to be, well, of course he disliked Xe'ra, everyone disliked Xe'ra, I'm so glad she's dead, right? Well, no, now don't get me wrong, she was annoying enough as just Light's heart, but my main issue was her death. Namely, it's the prime example of something happening in the lore because of fan service, because of being popular rather than because it would make sense. Or rather, it's second place in that, and I'll talk about first place later. Anyway, I've discussed my problems with Xe'ra in depth in that same Illidan video I mentioned earlier, so again, to give a very short TLDR, Before the moment of her death, Illidan, as stated in his novel, had seen Xe'ra and her offer to be embraced by the light as just something too good to be true, something awesome that could never happen to someone as corrupting as him. So having him refuse because it's a sacrifice he's unwilling to make, also even though his entire character in Legion is him babbling about the sacrifices he's made, is at best character derailment and at worst brainless fan service. And also think about this. Xe'ra, one of the most powerful and important beings in the universe, has just been killed, and nobody reacts to that. Sure, Turalyon gets a bit mad for a bit, but he gets over it just as quickly. And lastly, I dislike the idea of turning the light and the void, who have always been the ultimate good and the ultimate evil in the lore, more morally grey. Though speaking of Storm Rages, I guess, my next like is Val'sharah. Val'sharah has become one of my favorite zones of all time. I guess I should update the old video on that, which is all the more notable since I wasn't particularly invested in the Nightmare storyline beforehand. I guess there's two things I really liked about it. Firstly, that the main storyline is tightly focused and very well delivered, and secondly, that it feels incredibly immersive and very personal. It feels like you're taking part in an Emerald Nightmare novel, a good one this time, and it's very dramatic. And even the side story with Gerard's Shadow Song was pretty good in its own right. On that note, my next dislike, and this is not one of the really major dislikes, but it's still annoying, is that Legion kind of feels like it suffers from the vanilla syndrome of having unfinished zone storylines. With the exception of Val'sharah, Suramar, and somewhat Stormheim, the zones don't feel like they truly ended, like they resolved. After the questline in Azuna, what happens? Well, the Legion is still there, still invading, the Naga are still there, the Nightfallen are still there, and Prince Ferrandis and his court are still ghosts, despite the prince having his moment of redemption. High Mountain is slightly better, but in the end, after the questlines, the Legion is still there, the Fell Totem are still there, and all the minor nuisances like the Harpies and some Drogbar attacks are still happening. And Argus is arguably worse since it's also an indirect slight to Velen's character, namely after finally reuniting with his long-lost brethren on Argus, who berate him for quote-unquote abandoning them 25,000 years ago. At the end of Antorus, he abandons them again. And speaking of Argus, I guess my next like on this list is what they did with Magni's character. It's honestly great to have him back, and his new role in the story is honestly very interesting. I also like that it plays into what the purpose of his original petrification was, to commune with Azeroth. And I like the fact that he did so on Argus as well, and how it plays into the storyline there, with him receiving visions from the planet and interacting with the Titans and such. Now on to the final dislike, and this is the last of the big three, and the prime example when I think of a decision made because of fan service rather than contributing to the story, namely Sylvanas being named War Chief. And no, I don't mean this because of her actions in battle for Azeroth. I was of this opinion from moment one. I think out of all of the Horde leaders, the only one who makes less sense to be War Chief is Gallywix. Sylvanas has always had a rocky relationship with the Horde and all of the other leaders of the Horde. She's never been representative of the values of the Horde, and really the only thing she has going for her is that she is theoretically a good military strategist. It's the prime example of a decision being made because it's popular, not because it makes sense, since Sylvanas was, at the time, the most popular character in Warcraft and might still be. Now, despite this, I was still willing to give this decision a chance if they could prove to me why she deserves to be War Chief in this expansion, and they didn't. Other than Stormheim, which was a very Sylvanas story but not a Horde story at all, the only other thing Sylvanas really does in Legion is yell at me to take over that tower from Greymane's forces, which again is a Sylvanas thing to do but not really a very War Chief of the Horde thing to do. You could make the argument that Vol'jin didn't really do many things as War Chief either, and that's true, and it's certainly a valid criticism to throw at Warlords of Draenor. But at least Vorgin had an entire arc, a novel, and part of the storyline of an expansion building up to him becoming war chief. It was the expected result. So Varnas getting that title just comes out of nowhere, and they haven't managed to convince me at least that she would deserve that title in the time of the Legion expansion. On the topic of changes in the leadership of the expansion of a faction, and here's an example of doing it right, my final like is Varian's death and Anduin's character arc. As I've mentioned before, Anduin is my favorite character in the story right now, and his relationship with Varian is one of my favorite character dynamics in Warcraft's story. I think that Varian died when his character development had reached its peak, so to say, where his story was fully fleshed out, so it didn't necessarily feel like his death was a waste of the character. And his death brought on the next stage in Anduin's development as a character, making it all in all seem well thought out and natural. I also really like Anduin's interactions with Velen and Greyman in the expansion, and well, in general, not much else to say about it. So I suppose this is the end of this particular video. I'm sure I've provided some unpopular opinions, and again, you are free to disagree with me. Anyway, leave any thoughts in the comments below, and I'll see you all later. Farewell.